Jessie Misskelley Jr., Jason Baldwin, Damien Echols. I hope your master, the devil, does take you soon. I want you to meet him real soon. And the day you die, I'm going to praise God. And I make you a promise. The day you die, every year on May 5th, I'm going to come to your graveside. I'm going to spit on you. I'm going to curse the day you were born. And I'm sure while I'm standing there, I'm going to have other bodily functions let go upon your grave. I promise you, as God is my witness, I'll visit all three of your graves.
In May of 1993, the small community of West Memphis, Arkansas, was forever changed by a crime so brutal, so shocking that it shook the entire nation. 3 8-year-old boys, Stevie Branch, Michael Moore, and Christopher Byers, were found murdered in a patch of woods known as Robin Hood Hills. Their bodies were discovered in a shallow creek, bound by their own shoelaces, with evidence suggesting they had suffered unspeakable violence. Stevie Edward Branch, Christopher Byers, and Michael Moore were all second graders at Weaver Elementary School. Each had achieved the rank of Wolf in the local Cub Scout pack and were best friends. Stevie Branch was the son of Stephen and Pamela Branch, who divorced when he was an infant. His mother was awarded custody and later married Terry Hobbs. Stevie was 8 years old, an honor student, and he lived with his mother Pamela Hobbs, his stepfather Terry Hobbs, and a 4-year-old half-sister Amanda. Stevie loved being a Cub Scout and carried around a pocket knife.
What are you holding in your hand?
In my hand, it's Stevie's Boy Scout. I got it back yesterday, and I've been wearing it around my head like this.
Did he like scouting?
Oh, he loved it. He loved it. Yeah. He loved it.
You blame yourself for this?
I have. I have been on a guilt trip about it, but it wasn't my fault. I was at work.
Christopher Byers was born to Melissa Defer and Ricky Murray. His parents divorced when he was 4 years old, and shortly afterwards his mother married John Mark Byers, who adopted him. Christopher was 8 years old, and he lived with his mother, Sharon Melissa Byers, his adoptive father, John Mark Byers, and his stepbrother, Sean Ryan Clark, aged 13.
Christopher never hurt anybody. He had a gentle, loving, and giving heart, and they crucified him in those woods. And they humiliated his little body. They took his little manhood before he even knew what it was. And I hate him for it. I've never hated anybody in my life.
Michael Moore was the son of Todd and Dana Moore. He was 8 years old and lived with his parents and his 9-year-old sister, Dawn. Michael was often viewed as the leader of the 3 boys.
I can't imagine what was going through Michael's mind. Was he calling for me? How long did they leave him there tied up on that ditch bank before they decided to kill him? What were they doing to him?
Let's look at the timeline. On Wednesday, May 5th, 1993, Christopher Byers, Michael Moore, and Stevie Branch attended school at Weaver Elementary. After school, Stevie's mother, Pam Hobbs, said she saw Stevie leave on his bike with Michael Moore at 3:30 p.m. She told him to be back by 4:30 because she had to go to work at 5 p.m. that night. But Stevie doesn't come back in time. Terry Hobbs drives Pam to work and then returns home to look for Stevie. According to his friend David Jacoby, Terry comes over to his house with his daughter Amanda, and he and Terry play guitars for about an hour. Terry then leaves to see if Stevie had come home yet. Christopher's mother, Melissa, said she saw Christopher come in and out of the house between 5 and 5:30 p.m. She was on the phone at the time, so she didn't talk to him and didn't know what he was coming into the house for. At 5:20 p.m, John Mark Byers, Christopher's adoptive father, said he saw Christopher riding his skateboard in the street and he hit him with a belt as punishment. He then told him to clean up the carport. At 6 p.m, the boys were seen riding their bikes on North 14th Street, West Memphis, heading to the direction of Goodwin. Dana Moore, Michael's mother, also saw them at this time. Michael's father, Todd Moore, is at work and he wouldn't be home until early the next morning. Meanwhile, John Mark Byers drives to the courthouse to pick up his stepson Ryan. Around 6:30 p.m, John Mark Byers saw that Christopher wasn't home. They had plans to go out to dinner, so he, Ryan and Melissa start driving around the neighborhood to look for him. At 7:30 p.m, they see a police officer in the area and tell him that they can't find their son. The officer tells them to go home and wait until about 8 p.m, and if he's not home by then call the police. So at 8 p.m, when Christopher still hasn't been found, John Mark calls the West Memphis police to report him missing. 10 minutes later, an officer shows up to interview him. Around 8:20 p.m, Dana Moore, having seen the police car, goes to the Byers' house to report Michael missing. As the officer leaves, Terry Hobbs, Stevie's stepfather, also goes to the Byers' house and meets John Mark for the first time. By 8:30, Byers and his stepson Ryan begin searching a wooded area about 4 acres called Robin Hood Hills. Word gets out that the 3 boys are missing, so other people join them in the search. Terry Hobbs, John Mark Byers, and many people from the neighborhood are out looking for the boys that evening. At 8:42 p.m, the West Memphis police received another phone call. This time it was from the Bojangles restaurant about a mile away from where the boys' bodies would later be discovered. The restaurant worker told police that a man had entered the restaurant covered in mud and blood and seemed confused. He had got blood all over the women's restroom, but the man fled before police arrived, and although blood scrapings were taken, this evidence was lost and therefore never tested. By 9:30 p.m, Terry Hobbs had picked up his daughter Amanda and gone to get Pam from work. Pam sees that only Amanda is in the car. She asks where Stevie is, and Terry tells her that they can't find him. Between 9:30 and 10 p.m, Narlene Hollingsworth, according to what she later tells police, sees Damien Echols and another person walking near the Blue Beacon on the edge of Robin Hood Hills. At this time, John Mark isn't ready to stop searching. He finds a police officer and continues to search with them until about 10:30 p.m. He then goes home and calls the sheriff's department, upset that there's no search and rescue out looking for the boys. He and Ryan then decide to go back into the woods to search again. On the edge of Robin Hood Hills was a truck wash called the Blue Beacon. John Mark goes there and explains his son is missing, and he and his stepson will be out searching in the area. But at midnight they go home, not having found anything. The other parents and John Mark spoke briefly in the street before turning in for the night. Between 5 and 6 a.m. early the next morning, the parents continue with the search. At this point, Todd Moore has arrived home from his truck driving shift and discovered that his son is missing. At 6 a.m., Gary Glitchell, Chief Inspector of the West Memphis Police Department, announces that 3 boys are missing and that he will direct the search efforts. At 1:45 p.m., officials discover the bodies of the 3 boys in Robin Hood Hills. At 4 p.m, the coroner arrives on the scene and pronounces the 3 boys dead. After the bodies of Stevie Branch, Michael Moore, and Christopher Byers were discovered on 6 of May 1993, the crime scene became the focus of an intense investigation. Law enforcement quickly roped off the area, securing it for forensic examination. Several key details were uncovered during the initial investigation that would later be critical in the case. These elements added to the mystery and raised more questions about the motive and execution of the crime. The boys were found naked, submerged in a creek. They were hog-tied, with their hands tied to their ankles by their own shoelaces. They had several injuries, cuts and bruises, and what may have been bite marks. Christopher Byers' genitals were mutilated, and it was determined that Christopher bled out and the other boys died from drowning. As investigators processed the scene, they noted a blood trail near where the bodies were found. This blood trail led toward the creek, suggesting that the boys may have been attacked elsewhere and dragged to the location where their bodies were discovered. Their clothing was found submerged in the creek and held in place with sticks, but there was a distinct lack of physical evidence pointing to a killer. It's also not clear where the boys were killed. It's believed that they were killed near the creek and then thrown into the water where they drowned. However, some evidence suggests that they may have been killed elsewhere and then dumped in the water later. One of the boys was found lying on his side. The other 2 were found face down. However, there was fixed lividity present on the backs and buttocks of all 3 boys. This means that they must have spent at least 2 to 3 hours lying on their backs after death in order for the blood to pool and fix on their backs. Due to lividity, the medical examiner put the time of death between 1 and 5 a.m. but the boys were missing from 6 p.m. So if they weren't killed and immediately put into the creek, they must have either been lying on their backs dead for hours when a search was underway and then placed in the creek later, or they were killed elsewhere and moved to the creek after the searches stopped for the night. Luminol testing performed by the creek, however, did light up and show what could have been blood, indicating that the boys were killed there. But luminol also reacts to urine, and being in the woods, animal urine would have likely been present, so the luminol isn't very helpful here. Though the state argued that the cooling of the bodies from the water would have slowed the fixing of lividity, when the boys were removed from the water, they were placed on their sides, so the lividity couldn't have formed on their backs after they were removed from the water. The lividity and Dr. Peretti's estimate that they died after 1 a.m. makes the timeline and location of the murders very confusing. After the bodies were recovered and the investigation into the crime scene continued, the police began to form a theory based on the gruesome nature of the killings.
I hope y'all really believe in your master, the Satan, Sleuthfoot, devil himself, because he's not going to help you. He's going to laugh at you, mock at you, and torture you. He didn't need your help. The devil's got all the devils he needs. The good Lord said Lucifer and a third of the angels were cast from heaven. He didn't need them, but he took their mind and he manipulated them. And they prayed to Satan and they prayed to the devil. And they had their satanic worship services out here. And they had all types of wild homosexual orgies, I've been told.
Investigators initially considered the possibility of a ritualistic or satanic motive, and this led them to their number one suspect. At the time of their arrests, Jessie Misskelley Jr. was 17 years old, Jason Baldwin was 16 years old, and Damien Echols was 18 years old. To understand how 3 teenagers came to be suspects in such a horrific crime, we need to go back to West Memphis in the early 1990s. This was a deeply religious community, a place where traditional values and a fear of anything remotely unusual were prevalent. The satanic panic of the 1980s had spread fear about the occult and satanic rituals throughout the country and Arkansas, like many places in the Bible Belt, which was particularly affected. The idea that dark hidden forces could be at work in the community was not far-fetched to many residents. On May 6, 1993, Steve Jones, a juvenile officer to Crittenden County, Arkansas, saw a shoe floating in the creek that ran through Robin Hood Hills. This shoe would lead police to discover the bodies of the 3 victims. Officer Sudbury spoke with Steve Jones the next day, and together they determined that the murders had satanic undertones. Sudbury asked Steve, who was familiar with the West Memphis youth, who in the community he thought were the worst devil worshippers. A name instantly came to his mind: Damien Echols. The next day, they went to Broadway Trailer Park where Damien lived to speak with him. While there, they got permission from his parents to interview him. They noticed he had a tattoo of a pentagram, a popular Wiccan symbol. After briefly snooping around Damien's room, they brought him into the police station for questioning a few days later. During this interview, the police asked Damien if he knew if one of the boys was beaten more severely than the others. Damien said he thought one of them was mutilated with his genitals cut. This was case closed in the eyes of the detectives. Since Christopher Byers did have his genitals cut, they thought only the killer would know this. But there were whispers around West Memphis already. The neighborhood was already talking about how one of the boys was mutilated, so Damien could have heard this from anyone. After this interview, Damien was allowed to go home, but detectives wanted more. They decided to bring in an acquaintance of Damien's, Jessie Misskelley. Jessie and Damien had dropped out of high school, however Jason earned high grades and demonstrated a talent for drawing and sketching. He liked heavy metal and was often seen wearing jeans and a band t-shirt. Damien and Jason were close friends and bonded over their similar tastes in music. They were acquainted with Jessie, but claimed they were not close friends with him, though others would claim that they saw each other frequently. Jessie was known to have fistfights with other teens, but he worked as a roofer and was trusted to look after other neighborhood kids. It suggested that Jessie had intellectual disabilities and a low IQ, which would have contributed to being coerced into making what some people think are false confessions. But his IQ is debated, and we'll get to that later. On June 3, 1993, Jessie Misskelley is brought in for questioning by the West Memphis Police Department. They wanted more information on Damien Echols and wanted to know what Jessie knew about him. But what police heard from Jessie was more than they were expecting. Questioning started at 10 a.m. with the consent of Jessie's father, though he was not in the room with them. At about 11:30 a.m., Jessie was given a polygraph, also with his father's consent. After failing the polygraph, he was questioned again and then made a confession at 2:20 p.m. He spent a total of 4 hours and 20 minutes in the presence of police before confessing to the crime. During this time, he was read his Miranda rights 3 times, which states that Jessie had the right to remain silent. However, Jessie's father never signed the waiver of Jessie's Miranda rights, which is a legal requirement when minors are interviewed by police. In his confession, Jessie claimed that Jason Baldwin called him early in the morning of May 5, 1993. During the call, Jason reportedly asked Jessie to join him and Damien in the Robin Hood Hills area. Jessie stated that he went to the area around 9 a.m. near a creek where he met Jason and Damien. While they were in the creek, 3 boys rode up on bicycles. Jason and Damien called out to the boys, who then approached the creek. According to Jessie, Jason and Damien began severely beating the boys. Jessie claimed he was merely an observer, but stated that at least 2 of the boys were raped and forced to perform oral sex on Baldwin and Echols. During the attack, Michael Moore tried to escape, but Jessie said he caught him and brought him back to Jason and Damien. Jessie alleged that Jason used a knife to cut the boys' faces and mutilate Christopher Byers' genital area. Damien reportedly used a large stick to hit one of the boys and strangle another. After the assault, the boys' clothes were removed and they were tied up. Jessie stated that he left the scene at this point, believing Christopher Byers was already dead. Later at home, Jessie claimed Jason called him and said, "We done it, and what are we going to do if somebody saw us?" Jessie also claimed he would hear Damien in the background during this phone call. While it appears on the surface that Jessie confessed willingly and quickly, there are many inconsistencies in his statements. Jessie changes the time that the murders occurred several times, first saying that he entered Robin Hood Hills at 9 a.m, later saying they were there at noon and that the boys had skipped school. This was demonstrably false because the 3 victims were in school that day. After some prompting, Jessie changes the time again to 5 p.m, then again to 7 p.m, before settling on 6 p.m. Other inconsistencies include Jessie saying the boys had been tied with rope when they were bound with their shoelaces. He also said that one of the boys had been choked when there was no evidence of strangulation. He also said that Damien screwed the boys, but there was no evidence of rape. And it does appear that the detectives ask him leading questions. For example, Ridge says, "Cutting him in the face, alright, another boy was cut, I understand. Where was he cut at?" "At the bottom." "On his bottom, was he face down and he was cutting him, or he was?" "Now you're talking about bottom, do you mean right here?" "Yes." "In his groin area?" "Yes." "Okay, do you know what his penis is?" "Yeah, that's where he was cut at." In this part of the interview, it's clear that Detective Ridge is leading Jessie with these questions and feeding him the information which Jessie just affirms. Jessie is not coming up with this information on his own. But there are other times when Jessie corrects the detectives, showing that he gives the correct information without being led. For example, Detective Ridge says, "Alright, have they got their clothes on when you saw them tied?" Jessie says no, they had them off. Jessie could have just said yes to this question, but corrects him. It appears that the boys were in fact naked when they were tied up, due to the way that they were tied, because it wouldn't have been possible to get their clothes off afterwards. A lot of people point to Jessie's first confession when they talk of his alleged false confessions. But Jessie confessed several other times, including twice to his own attorney, once before the trial and once after his conviction, and both times without police presence. A few days after his first confession, Jessie confessed again on June 11th. He had a private meeting with his defense attorney. While the meeting wasn't recorded, his lawyer took notes and testified about it in court. In the notes, the attorney had written down that Jessie told him that he had started hitting the boy in the scout uniform and knocked him unconscious. The notes also go into more grisly details about what Jessie had told him. On August 19th, Jessie again meets with his defense team who discuss plea bargains with him. Jessie does not retract any of his statements at this time, but come December, Jessie retracts his statements saying he made them all up. After his trial and conviction on February 5th, 1994, he confesses to police in the car driving him to prison. A few days later, Jesse meets with his defense attorneys again. His lawyer tells Jesse that he had confessed, then taken it back, then confessed again. He asks Jesse, "What is the truth?" Jesse replies, "The truth is that me and Jason and Damien done it." The lawyer then asks, "You were there when the boys were killed?" And Jesse says, "Yes, sir." Jesse is also given a Bible to swear on, and he swears on the Bible that he, Damien, and Jason were responsible. During his visit with his attorneys, he tells them something extremely interesting. He said that on the night of the murders, he was drunk on Evan Williams whiskey. He said during the murders, he broke the bottle by throwing it off a bridge, and if they went to the bridge, they would see the bottle lying there. His lawyer told prosecutors he would believe his client's confession if he could find that bottle. So his lawyer, Inspector Gary Glitchell, and the prosecutors drove to West Memphis to look for it. They found a broken Evan Williams bottle in the exact area that Stidham indicated Jesse said it would be. Additionally, Jesse's friend Vicky Hutchison confirmed that she had bought Jesse a bottle of Evan Williams whiskey on the day of the murders. While this is compelling, Evan Williams whiskey was very popular, and they found this bottle a whole 9 months after the murders, giving plenty of time for someone else to discard a bottle in that location, which would make it a coincidence. Or perhaps Jesse had thrown that bottle there, but before the night of the murders. A couple of more times after this, Jesse again speaks with his lawyers but doesn't retract anything. He said he's scared of testifying in Damien and Jason's trial. He then confesses to the prosecutors against his attorney's wishes. During this confession, the prosecutors make Jesse aware that he is not being offered any plea deals or privileges for his confession. But before Jesse was even questioned by police, he allegedly confessed to a friend of his. On May 6th, the morning after the murders, Buddy Lucas, a friend of Jesse, stopped by his home. According to Buddy, Jesse told him that he was involved in the murders the night before. According to Buddy, Jesse broke out in a sweat, cried, and gave him a pair of shoes, saying he didn't want to see them anymore. Did he kill the boys wearing these shoes and wanted to get rid of them? That seems to be what the police thought. While none of these confessions look good for Jesse, he may have had below-average intelligence that would have impaired his ability to truly understand the consequences of his words. But his low IQ is disputed. According to the psychologist who examined him and interpreted his results, his IQ was actually average. Here's some of the testimony. Davis says, "Okay, and in 1992 there was also, prior to the time you did your examination, there was another IQ test, correct?" "Yes." "What was his performance IQ at that time?" 88. "Okay, and what was his full-scale IQ at that time?" 73. "Okay, so the 2 past IQ exams that had been performed on him immediately prior to the one you did indicated that his performance level was in the average range, is that correct?" "Low average, yes. The first placed low average, the second one average, yes." "Okay, well, am I correct in understanding that anything above 80 is in the average?" "That depends on the criteria you want to go by. Typically, it's Social Security uses 80 above, other places use 84, so yeah. So by most criteria, 84 and 88 would be in the average range, yes." But while his IQ may have been actually average, he was still only 17, didn't have a lawyer present during questioning, and may have been susceptible to pressure. It's still completely possible that his confessions were false. After all, there are many inconsistencies. And later, when Jesse recanted his confession, he said that he made up certain details. He claimed that his friend in search and rescue told him that one of the boys' genitals was cut, and this friend testified to that at his trial. And Jesse claimed that police did coerce him to confess, saying that police drew a circle where Jesse claimed that they put himself, Damien, and Jason inside the circle and asked him if he wanted to join the police on the outside, before showing him a picture of Christopher Byers post-mortem. That would be enough to scare any 17-year-old, regardless of IQ. And his attorney would later say that Jesse told him the reason he confessed post-conviction was because people told him he could get out of prison if he did. But that conversation with Jesse wasn't recorded, so we can't know for sure that Jesse believed that. After Jesse's first confession, police got search warrants for Damien and Jason's homes. From Jason Baldwin's homes, officers seized a red robe belonging to his mother, 15 black t-shirts and a white t-shirt. At Damien Echols' home, they collected 2 notebooks containing writings they believed were related to satanic occult practices, a red t-shirt, blue jeans, and a pair of boots. A state crime laboratory witness testified about fibers found at the crime scene. According to this testimony, fibers on the victim's clothing were microscopically similar to fibers found in Jason Baldwin and Damien Echols' homes. No fibers matching items from Jessie Misskelley's home were found. Specifically, there was a red fiber from Jason Baldwin's mother's bathrobe, which was deemed microscopically similar to fibers from Michael Moore's shirt. Interestingly, one of Jessie's cellmates named Michael Johnson wrote to prosecutors on October 24, 1994, explaining that Jessie had told him that he, Damien, and Jason had left a nightgown at the crime scene because they wanted it to look like women had committed the crime. Could that have been Jason's mother's bathrobe? There was also a green polyester fibre found on Michael Moore's cap, and it was described as similar to fibres from a blue cotton polyester shirt belonging to a child relative in Damien's home. There were additional fibres from this same shirt that were matched to a cotton fibre and a polyester fibre found on Michael Moore's blue pants. But the defence challenged the fibre evidence, presenting an expert who disputed the supposed matches. It was revealed that these fibres were generic and could have originated from many items sold at local stores. Despite this, prosecutors introduced the fibre evidence to link Baldwin and Echols to the crime scene. Blue candle wax was found on the shirt of victim Stevie Branch. What appeared to be blue candle wax was found on a book in Damien's bedroom. A small blue candle was also found on a table in his girlfriend Dominique Tier's bedroom, but it was never proven that the waxes matched. Jason Baldwin's clothing was also presented during Jessie Misskelley's trial to corroborate Jessie's confession, specifically to show Jason owned clothing similar to what Jessie had described. However, no fibre or blood evidence definitively linked Jason's clothing to the murders. Damien's notebooks and writings were also introduced as evidence, with the prosecution arguing they reflected an obsession with the occult. This was a key part of the prosecution's narrative, as they claimed the murders were motivated by satanic rituals, despite no concrete evidence supporting this theory. But one of the biggest pieces of evidence for the prosecution was the knife. In November 1993, police retrieved a knife with a serrated edge from a lake behind Jason Baldwin's house. Dr. Frank Peretti testified that some of the wounds on the victims could have been caused by a serrated knife. Damien Echols' ex-girlfriend, Deanna Holcomb, testified that he had owned once a similar knife with a compass on the handle. During the trial, a knife distributor testified that the lake knife had a missing compass. Additionally, one of the injuries on Stevie Branch's head was thought to have been caused by a pipe-shaped weapon. The handle of the knife is round, similar to a pipe, and the measurements of the injury and the knife handle are almost exact. During the trial, the prosecution tried to prove that the injuries to the boys were caused by this serrated knife. But the defense argued that these wounds were the result of animal activity after death, specifically from snapping turtles. The documentary West of Memphis goes into detail about this, alleging that the knife the prosecutors found in the lake was not used in the murders at all, but it should be noted that this documentary was made by supporters of Damien, Jason, and Jessie. In it, experts claim that Christopher's genitals were not cut off, and all scratches and wounds were the result of animal activity. But the state would refute all these claims with their own experts. The state forensics expert Dr. Frank Peretti thought that the defense's animal predation claims were ridiculous because they had only observed the photographs of the injuries, they had not examined the bodies in person. Concerning Christopher Byers' injuries, Dr. Peretti said, "There were multiple wounds in the inner thighs. In my view, all of the wounds occurred prior to death. Though I wrote that the wounds looked post-mortem, you could see hemorrhage in the tissues. There were some injuries to the buttocks and what I described as superficial cutting wounds in parallel lines. There was some drying of the tissues. I don't know any kind of animal that would have caused this kind of pattern of wounds." There were ghost cells found on the penis slides. These indicated the leaching of blood. The serrated knife that you have here could have inflicted the pattern wounds on the skin. I found that the knife shown to me by the state had patterns consistent with linear gouges on the remains of Mr. Byers. Dr. William Q. Sterner, the chief medical examiner at the time of the autopsies, and I personally examined the bodies of the 3 boys, along with Dr. Kevin Dugan, a forensic dentist. Dr. Dugan's findings that none of the wounds appeared to be human bite marks was subsequently corroborated by Dr. Harry Mintzer. Second, as part of the autopsy process, tissue samples were taken from some of the superficial and penetrating wounds. When examined grossly and microscopically, these samples demonstrated presence of hemorrhage, clearly indicative of antemortem injury and not post-mortem animal activity. Third, physical examination of the penetrating wounds showed a lack of soft tissue bridging typical of wounds caused by tearing or biting. These wounds did show clearly incised edges, indicating they were caused by a sharp instrument. Finally, I have consulted with Dr. Charles Cokes, the current chief medical examiner, regarding the autopsies, and he concurs in the findings made and the conclusions drawn from them. Regarding this evidence, it seems more likely that the wounds on the victims' bodies were caused by a knife similar to the one found in the lake, but we can't be certain that that knife was indeed the murder weapon. And another small piece of evidence that a knife was used at the crime scene is the fact that one of the boys' shoelaces remained in their shoe, but all 3 boys were tied with their hands to their ankles, requiring 6 shoelaces. So how were they all tied if one shoelace was still in the shoe? Well, one of the shoelaces binding the boys had been cut in half, which would have required a knife or scissors, but who carries scissors? The night Damien Echols was arrested, police seized a necklace he was wearing, which appeared to have blood spots. The necklace was sent for testing, but the results were unavailable during the initial trial proceedings. The prosecution requested a continuance to obtain the results, which the court granted. Testing revealed that one blood spot was consistent with Damien's blood type, while another blood spot matched the blood type shared by Jason Baldwin and Stevie Branch, but also approximately 11% of the global population. Due to the small quantities of genetic material available, no definitive link to any individual could be established. The 3 victims had their wrists tied to their ankles with their own shoelaces. There were 3 different knots used, possibly pointing to 3 different killers. Additionally, it would have been difficult for one person to control the 3 boys, pointing to more than one perpetrator. But that doesn't necessarily mean it was Jason, Damien, or Jessie. After gathering this evidence, the police set about interviewing people who knew Damien and Jason. During the trial of Damien Echols and Jason Baldwin, Narlene Hollingsworth claimed that on the night of May 5th, 1993, she was driving to a friend's house when she saw Damien and his girlfriend Dominique Tier walking near the Blue Beacon truck stop around 9:30 p.m. She stated that Damien was wearing a dark-coloured shirt, which she described as dirty, while Dominique was wearing black pants with white floral patches. During Jessie Misskelley's trial, Narlene's daughter Tabitha repeated her mother's account. Although there were 7 people in the Hollingsworth car that night, only 4 testified to seeing Damien and Dominique. Ricky Hollingsworth, Narlene's husband, admitted he could not identify the figures due to the darkness and the brief nature of the sighting. The ability of the witness to identify Damien and Dominique, and even determine the condition of Damien's clothing, was questionable given the circumstances. Adding to the inconsistencies, the prosecution itself implied that the witnesses might have been mistaken, suggesting the second figure might have been Jason Baldwin, wearing grey jeans with holes in the knees that he was known to own. Anthony Hollingsworth further undermined his mother's testimony by placing the sighting at an hour later than the time Narlene claimed. But Narlene Hollingsworth was sure she saw Damien and Dominique. She said, "I wouldn't change my story if I was dying. I know that freckled-faced, red-headed girl anywhere. It was Dominique, not a boy." So if Damien and Dominique were out together during this time, then it's unlikely that Damien was involved in the murders. Damien's mental health records, totaling over 500 pages, were presented during the sentencing phase of his trial in an attempt to spare him from the death penalty by demonstrating his mental instability. However, the details of these records are often omitted or underemphasized in documentaries about this case. Here are some key points from those records. Regarding family concerns and psychiatric hospitalizations, Damien was committed to a psychiatric hospital twice by court order and once voluntarily by his parents in 1992. His parents described him as dangerous and expressed fear for their safety and that of other children in the home. Apparently, he threatened to cut his mother's throat and claimed to have threatened to kill his father and eat him. Regarding his self-reported mental state, Damien identified himself as homicidal, suicidal, schizophrenic, manic-depressive, and sociopathic in a handwritten document. He also had violent tendencies. Reports include assaults on classmates and setting fires at school. He once tried to gouge out another student's eyeball. And more concerning is that witnesses allege he stomped a dog to death in 1992, a behaviour often linked to early warning signs of violent offenders. Damien also seemed to have delusions of grandeur. He claimed to be possessed by a spirit named Rosie, believing he was a god or Christ, and said he gained power by drinking blood. He said, "Evil spirits possess me sometimes." But Damien denied being a Satanist and said he was more into witchcraft and demonology. In one of Jessie's confessions, he told police that Damien had sucked the blood from one of the boy's genitals after he was mutilated. Damien's medical records show that Damien did have a liking for blood. Joyce Curitan, director of the Craighead County Juvenile Detention Center, reported on one incident where Damien sucked the blood of another inmate. She said, approximately 3 hours after Damien arrived, he was sitting in the rec area with several other residents. One of the boys had scraped his arm a little, and it was bleeding some. Without warning, Damien grabbed the arm that was bleeding and began to suck the blood from it. The boys all stated he had been saying he had not taken his medication the night before, and he was about to go off on them. Damien was asked why he did this, and he stated, "I don't know." In January 1993, Sherry Dawkins filed a longer individual progress note. She wrote, "Focus of today's session is spent talking with Damien about his feelings of death. He brought with him to session a poem that he had written during the past week. The theme of this poem centered around death and power. Damien explained that he obtains his power by drinking blood of others. He typically drinks the blood of a sexual partner or of a ruling partner. This is achieved by biting or cutting. He states, 'It makes me feel like a god.' Damien described drinking blood as giving him more power and strength. He remembers doing this as far back as age 10. He does not remember where he learned to do this. These mental health records show that Damien was a troubled teenager, but doesn't make him capable of a brutal murder of 3 young boys. He said himself that he was homicidal, and his own parents were afraid of him. But was he a child killer? The prosecution thought he was guilty and attempted to bolster their case by presenting 3 additional witnesses who alleged Damien and Jason verbally confessed to the murders. 2 of these witnesses testified that they overheard Damien at a softball game saying, "I killed the 3 little boys, and before I turn myself in, I'm going to kill 2 more. I already have one of them picked out." They claimed Damien made these comments to a group of friends. However, under cross-examination, the defense revealed significant issues with their testimony. The witnesses admitted they could not hear anything else said during the conversation or identify any of the people Damien was allegedly speaking to. One witness even provided a timeline that placed the supposed confession after Damien had already been arrested. Additionally, the softball game where they claimed to hear Damien's statement occurred in early May, yet they only reported the incident to police after seeing a news report about Damien's arrest. The third witness, Michael Carson, testified that Jason had confessed to him in jail, but Carson later admitted that he was a drug addict and unreliable. As for a motive, the prosecution tried to claim a satanic ritual of sorts. During Jason Baldwin and Damien Echols' trial, the prosecution introduced Dr. Dale Griffiths to establish this theory. Griffiths was a self-proclaimed cult expert and had obtained his doctorate through a correspondence course from Columbia Pacific University, an unaccredited institution. Despite questionable credentials and the FBI's stance that satanic ritual murders are largely unfounded myths, Judge Burnett allowed his testimony. Griffiths argued that the crime scene displayed occult characteristics, citing the following points. The murders occurred near a pagan holiday and a full moon. Children were allegedly sought in occult sacrifices for their life force. The number 3 symbolized occult significance. The victims' ages connected to the number 8, which he claimed had witchcraft relevance. Rituals near water were supposedly linked to baptism or cleansing rites. The tying of the victims exposed their genitalia, aligning with ritual practices. The mutilation of Christopher Byers was significant in occult beliefs about semen collection. The lack of blood at the scene suggested it had been stored for future rituals. Overkill and wounds on the left side reflected satanic symbolism, and a cleared area on the bank was consistent with ceremonial activity. However, critics have debunked Griffith's claims as based on misinformation and myth, and rightly they do sound like bullshit. Neo-pagan holidays such as Beltane are celebrated on May 1st, not 4 days later, and Satanists do not observe full moons as ritual dates. No evidence supports claims of ritual child murders in the US, and many of Griffith's assertions, such as the significance of numbers or rituals involving blood and semen, are biologically and historically inaccurate. Ritual practices like altars, circles, and candles, which would typically be present in occult activities, were absent from the crime scene. In Jessie Misskelley's trial, the focus on satanic elements was minimal. Instead, the prosecution highlighted a statement from Melissa Byers, Christopher's mother. She claimed Christopher told her 6 weeks before his death that a man in black had taken his photograph. This claim emerged only after Damien had become a suspect. But what's interesting is that in one of Jessie's confessions, he claimed that Damien had a briefcase with pictures of the victims in it, but this briefcase was never found. Finally, let's look at their alibis for the night of the murders. Jason didn't have an alibi. His defense didn't present one at his trial. Jessie's supporters claimed he was at a wrestling match on the night of the murders, but there is no proof that the match he attended was on May 5th. In fact, during trial, this alibi was torn apart. Fred Revell, a wrestler who often wrestled with Jessie, testified that Jessie was with him on the night of May 5th, and remembered clearly it was May 5th because that night he had paid $300 to purchase a wrestling ring. But the prosecution presented his receipt for the ring in court. The date on that receipt was April 27th, a week before the murders. Other wrestlers and friends of Jessie claimed he was wrestling on May 5th, but their testimonies were picked apart as well and proven to be unsubstantiated, with some of the witnesses conceding that they weren't actually sure it was May 5th. As for Damien, he claimed to be on the phone with 3 other people during the time of the murders, but none of those people have confirmed the alibi. Damien claimed he talked to Holly George that night. Holly told police she didn't talk to Damien that evening. She said she spoke with him much earlier in the afternoon, around 3 or 4 p.m. Damien claimed he spoke with Heather Cleette that evening. Cleette said she'd been unable to reach Echols until about 10:30 p.m. She also mentioned that Holly George told her that Echols had been out walking around that night. Damien's pregnant girlfriend Dominique Tier said she last saw Damien around 5 or 5:30 p.m. on May 5th. She said she did not speak to him again until Damien called her around 10 p.m. And another girl, Jennifer Bearden, told police she called Jason's house between 4:15 and 5:30 p.m. on May 5th. She said Jason answered the phone and she talked to Jason and Damien for about 20 minutes. Damien told her he and Jason were going somewhere and to call him back at 8 p.m. When Bearden called Damien's house at 8 p.m, his grandmother answered, and she said that Damien wasn't there. In her police statement, Bearden said she finally reached Damien around 9:20 p.m. So this does leave a gap in Damien's evening. But something else that needs to be mentioned when talking about Damien is the lies that he tells. In a 2010 interview, Damien stated that at the time of the murders, he had been living in Marion, Arkansas, approximately 10 to 15 miles from West Memphis. However, during his trial, he testified that his residence was at the Broadway Trailer Park in West Memphis, located within 2 miles of the crime scene. In his 1994 testimony, Damien claimed he frequently walked around West Memphis, but in a 2010 interview he stated he hardly went to West Memphis. In 1994, Damien testified that he walked through the neighborhoods near Robin Hood Hills 2 to 3 times a week. He also mentioned having lived as a child in the Mayfair apartments across from Robin Hood Hills. Additionally, on a police questionnaire, he confirmed familiarity with Robin Hood Hills. But in a 2010 interview, Damien denied knowing the crime scene area, claiming it was a residential area he avoided, as he only visited West Memphis for places like Walmart. And in more recent interviews, Damien claimed that his mother and sister visited him in prison only a handful of times. However, both his mum and sister have publicly contradicted this, asserting that his statements are untrue and they both visit him weekly or fortnightly. While lying is not a proof of guilt, it certainly doesn't help Damien's likability or his quest for proof of innocence. So why is he doing it? And it does make people question, what else is he lying about? So with the evidence against the West Memphis Three laid out, let's look at the evidence that points away from them, towards other people. The West Memphis police owned in on Damien, Jason and Jessie right away, but there were other people that should have been investigated, notably the parents. People are far more likely to be killed by someone they know, especially child victims. It's completely wrong that the police didn't at least consider Terry Hobbs or John Mark Byers. We'll get into those two in a second, but the obvious person of interest that was never investigated was Mr. Bojangles. On the night of the murders, Marty King, manager of the Bojangles restaurant near Robin Hood Hills, reported a black man, dazed and covered in blood and mud, lingering in the women's restroom for about an hour. Officer Reagan Meek responded but did not enter the building as it was outside her jurisdiction. Later, after the man had vanished, police collected blood samples from the restroom, but they were lost. This incident gained importance when a lab report revealed that one hair found on the sheet that was used to carry Christopher Byers' body was from an individual of African descent. Unfortunately, this unidentified man was never found or investigated, so the information regarding Mr. Bojangles ends there. But what about John Mark Byers? In 1993, John Mark Byers, stepfather of victim Christopher Byers, handed a knife to a documentary film crew, the ones who made the documentary Paradise Lost. When questioned, he initially claimed it had never been used and remained in a drawer. However, after being informed that blood was found on the knife, Byers changed his story, stating he had used it to cut venison. The blood matched his own blood type, but also Christopher's. After he was made aware of that detail, he changed his story again and said he probably cut himself with it. Additionally, a black Caucasian hair on the victim's clothing was microscopically similar to both John Mark Byers and Damien Echols, though no further analysis was performed. So some people think it wasn't the lake knife that was used in the murders, but the one belonging to John Mark. John Mark also admitted to taking medications, including Xanax and Zoranol, but he omitted Tegretol, which was found in non-therapeutic levels in Christopher's blood post-mortem. Despite these suspicious findings, Byers was never seriously investigated. Notably, he was a known drug informant for the West Memphis police and maintained close relationships with officers. This favoritism may have caused investigators to overlook evidence implicating him. Other evidence, such as a tennis shoe print on the creek bank near the bodies, did not match any footwear owned by Damien, Jason, or Jessie. Could it have been John Mark's? Well, we'll never know. Unfortunately, John Mark Byers died in a car crash in 2020. Before Jessie Misskelley's trial, his attorney Daniel Stidham inquired if a criminal profile had been developed for the case. Stidham's efforts to secure an independent profiler failed until Brent Turvey, a respected forensic scientist and criminal profiler, agreed to work pro bono after the convictions. Turvey conducted a thorough forensic review of the crime scene evidence, autopsy reports, and related documentation, uncovering significant oversights, including Stevie Branch's facial injuries, initially attributed to a serrated knife, were identified as human adult bite marks by Dr. Thomas David, a forensic odontologist. Suction-like bite marks were also found on Christopher Byers' inner thigh. An impression resembling a knife handle was noted near the genital mutilation on Christopher, yet its connection to the murder weapons remains unverified. A footwear-like abrasion on Stevie Branch's head and a torn piece of cloth clutched in Michael Moore's hand were not thoroughly investigated. Turvey made several conclusions that pointed towards the boys knowing their murderer. He noted, the location lacked blood or other evidence consistent with the severity of injuries inflicted, supporting the theory that the boys were killed elsewhere. The attackers likely had a personal connection with the victims, particularly Christopher and Stevie, suggesting a trust-based abduction. The mutilation of Christopher's genitals and violence against Stevie suggested rage rooted in a personal grievance. Christopher Byers showed signs of prior abuse, including healed injuries and behavioural concerns reported by his mother before his death. Self-inflicted genital injuries on Stevie Branch suggested possible sexual abuse. Turvey proposed that the crime involved two perpetrators, a dominant male offender focusing on Christopher, and an accomplice who expressed rage differently, possibly a female, based on the nature of some bite marks. The primary assailant likely struggled with shame or confusion regarding their own sexual impulses, especially towards males. This could explain the punitive nature of the genital mutilation, which was likely an expression of both rage and conflicted sexual ownership of Christopher. But most of John Mark's time is accounted for. He simply didn't have time to kill the boys because he was with his family the whole evening. He picked up his stepson Ryan from court at 6 p.m. and they both came home. Meanwhile, Christopher was cleaning up the carport. Between 6 and 6:30 p.m, Christopher had disappeared, and John Mark, Christopher's mother, Melissa, and Ryan went out looking for him. At 7:30 p.m, John Mark speaks to a police officer in front of Dollar General on Broadway. He tells him to call police at 8 p.m. if Christopher still isn't home. Between 7:30 and 8 p.m, the Byers family stop at a neighbour's house, the Garners, asking if they've seen Christopher. The Garners confirm that they spoke with the family. At 8 p.m, John Mark called the police to report Christopher missing. So during the time when the state says the boys went missing and were killed, John Mark's time is accounted for. Unless, of course, they were killed in the middle of the night, and then everything is thrown into question again. But if the boys knew their killer, and it wasn't John Mark Byers, or Todd Moore because he was working outside of West Memphis at the time, who does that leave? Well, the next person to look at is Terry Hobbs. Terry Hobbs claimed that he first met John Mark Byers and Dana Moore at 6 p.m. on the night of May 5th, but John Mark denies this and said it was after 8 p.m. that they met for the first time. And John Mark is probably correct because at 6 p.m. he was at the courthouse picking up Ryan. And at 6 p.m, Dana Moore didn't think the boys were missing because she saw them riding their bikes. At 6:30 p.m, John Mark, Ryan and Melissa were out driving around the neighbourhood looking for Christopher, so it seems like Terry Hobbs is totally wrong in his account of seeing them at 6 p.m. John Mark accused Terry Hobbs of seeking an alibi and claims that Terry became enraged when John Mark wouldn't agree that they met at 6 p.m. So if the 6 p.m. meeting between the parents didn't happen, what was Terry Hobbs doing at this time? Terry drove Stevie's mother Pam to work at 5 p.m. Their daughter Amanda was also in the car. According to Terry's friend David Jacoby, Terry came over to his house with Amanda after dropping off Pam and they hung out and played guitars for about an hour. According to Terry, he meets with Dana Moore and John Mark Byers to ask if they knew where Stevie was at 6 p.m. But this, as we've just pointed out, is incorrect. It means that Terry Hobbs' time is unaccounted for between roughly 6 p.m. to just after 8 p.m. That's precisely when the state says the boys disappeared and were killed. According to John Mark, Terry Hobbs told him that he was searching the woods with Officer Meek that evening, but Officer Meek didn't search the woods. It seemed that Terry is grasping at straws to make himself seen by others in the neighbourhood. One interesting fact is that Stevie carried a pocket knife with him everywhere. His mother said he loved it, but after his death, Terry Hobbs had it in his possession. And Stevie's mother Pam was shocked when she discovered that Terry had it. After all, she said, she was convinced that Stevie would have had it on him at the time of his death, but Terry claimed he took the knife from Stevie because he would have got into trouble if he took it to school with him. One piece of evidence that links Terry to the crime scene is a hair that was found caught in one of the knots tying up Michael Moore. Since the hair was caught in a ligature, it seems less likely that it was transferred and instead fell when the killer was tying the knot. For what it's worth, it appears to be a beard hair. This hair was found to not be inconsistent with Terry Hobbs. Mitochondrial DNA is passed through the mother's lineage, and it cannot match a person, only rule people out. The DNA ruled out Damien, Jessie, and Jason, but it did not rule out Terry Hobbs. The defense said in court that the hair could belong to about 1.5% of the population, which is about 5 million Americans, or roughly 12,000 people in the West Memphis metro area. That is still a lot of people. However, another hair was found on a tree trunk nearby at the crime scene, and this hair was found to not be inconsistent with David Jacoby, Terry's friend. But this hair could match 7% of the population, which again is a lot of people. But to have two hairs at the scene that don't rule out two key people in the case who were friends and with each other the night of the crime is compelling. But for what it's worth, there were several other hairs found at the scene, including one on Michael Moore's Cub Scout cap that was not linked to anybody. And Michael Moore spent a lot of time at Stevie's house, so it's not impossible that the hair could have been transferred from the home. But here's some more inconsistencies in Terry's statements. According to Terry, he said he never saw Stevie that evening. But according to one witness, it seems that Terry Hobbs might have actually been the last person to see the three boys alive. Jamie Clark Ballard, who lived 3 doors down from Terry and Pam Hobbs, said in her sworn affidavit, "Between 5:30 p.m. and 6:30 p.m, I saw Stevie Branch, Michael Moore and Christopher Byers playing in my backyard. I am absolutely, completely and totally positive that I saw Terry Hobbs hollering at Stevie, Michael and Christopher to get back down to the Hobbs house at approximately 6:30 p.m. If Terry Hobbs said he did not see Stevie Branch, Michael Moore or Christopher Byers on May 5th, 1993, he is not telling the truth. I know for a fact that Terry Hobbs saw, was with and spoke to Stevie, Michael and Christopher on May 5th, 1993. If this witness is correct, it means that Terry Hobbs was possibly the last person to see the boys alive. And in fact, she wasn't the only witness to have sworn an affidavit stating they saw Terry Hobbs with the boys before they died. 2 other witnesses said they saw Terry shouting after the boys before they rode their bikes into Robin Hood Hills at approximately 6:30 p.m. These 3 witnesses directly contradict Terry Hobbs, who said he never saw Stevie that evening. However, other witnesses in the neighbourhood give different accounts. For example, Kim Williams said she saw Michael Moore and Stevie Branch go into the woods between 5:30 and 6 p.m. But perhaps they went into the woods and came out again. Christopher Byers joined them, and then Terry Hobbs chased after them at 6:30 p.m. Either way, it looks like Terry has been trying to distance himself from the crime scene and from seeing the boys that evening. And Terry Hobbs has an alarming criminal past. When Terry Hobbs was 24, he broke into the home of his neighbour, Mildred French. French reported that prior to this incident, she had gone to Hobbs's residence after hearing what she believed to be a domestic dispute. A few months later, French contacted the police and her landlord, alleging that Hobbs entered her home uninvited and grabbed her breast. She described shouting at him to leave, recounting, "I was yelling for Terry to get out, and ultimately Terry ran out of my home and downstairs to his unit. The bathroom window over my tub was partially open, and my yelling could be heard outside. I recall a man across the street working in his yard who may have heard me. I believe Terry intended to further molest or harm me, as his actions and demeanour suggested that this was his goal. However, my continued yelling and screaming appeared to alarm him, prompting him to flee. At the time, I feared Terry would rape, harm, or even kill me." And in November 1994, over a year after the murders of the 3 children in West Memphis, Terry Hobbs faced legal trouble again. Following an altercation with his wife Pam Hobbs, during which he reportedly struck her, Hobbs shot his brother-in-law Jackie Jr. Hicks. Hicks had come to the Hobbs residence after learning about the incident. Hobbs later claimed the shooting was in self-defense. While Jackie Jr. survived the initial injuries, he died later due to complications relating to the shooting. Hobbs was sentenced to 6 months in prison for aggravated assault. These incidents show that Terry Hobbs is not a nice guy. He's violent and capable of sexual assault. Another witness, one of Stevie's aunts, allegedly saw Terry Hobbs cleaning and doing laundry on the night of the murders. It could be nothing, but apparently this man was not someone who regularly did housework. Perhaps he was cleaning away evidence. Terry Hobbs was not questioned during the initial investigation, but after the DNA evidence came to light about the hair, he was questioned in 2007. But he swore that he never saw Stevie at all that evening, explaining that he got home from work at about 3:30 p.m. but didn't see him. But one thing that does point to Stevie being home for a period of time after school is the fact that Stevie had undigested vegetables, possibly green beans, in his stomach when he died. His mother said that she prepared steak, mashed potatoes, and green beans for dinner that day, which means, if Pam is correct in her memory, that at some point after Stevie came home from school, he was at his house eating. It's possible that Stevie came home to eat while his mum was at work and Terry was at David Jacoby's house, or it means he was at home eating while Terry was there, in which Terry lied. Of course, Pam could be misremembering since she had to go to work that day at 5 p.m. Another alarming piece of evidence against Terry Hobbs comes from a drug dealer called Billy Wayne Stewart, who supplied Terry Hobbs with small amounts of marijuana, cocaine, and meth. The story is a little complicated due to the number of people involved, But Stewart, in his sworn affidavit, says that on the day of the murders, 2 teenagers, L.G. Hollingsworth and Buddy Lucas, showed up at his house to buy some weed. While he sold them the weed, he said he saw Terry Hobbs and David Jacoby kissing in a pickup truck across the street while they waited for the teenagers to bring back the drugs. In April 1995, 2 years after the murders, Buddy Lucas told Stewart what happened after he sold him the weed that day. According to Buddy Lucas's 1995 confession to Stewart, after purchasing the marijuana, the group drove around town drinking whiskey and smoking pot before stopping near the Blue Beacon Woods. Lucas recounted that Terry Hobbs encouraged the teenagers to wrestle while he and Jacoby watched, with Stewart strongly inferring that this wrestling turned into sexual activity. During this time, the 3 victims, Christopher Byers, Michael Moore and Stevie Branch, arrived on their bicycles, stumbling into the scene. Lucas claimed that Hobbs shouted, "Get them little fuckers," and Jacoby began beating one of the boys. Terry Hobbs allegedly ordered Lucas and Hollingsworth to remove the boys' pants. Stewart's affidavit describes Hobbs committing horrifying acts, including biting the boy's genitals and then mutilating him with a knife. Fearing exposure, Hobbs reportedly declared the other boys must be killed. Together, Hobbs and Jacoby murdered the children, after which their bodies and belongings were hidden in the water. Another affidavit sworn by a man named Benny Guy corroborates much of this account. He stated that Buddy Lucas, while staying with him in 1994, confessed his role in the murders. L.G. Hollingsworth also confessed to Guy while they were both in jail in 1995. Hollingsworth's account added further details, including Hobbs becoming enraged when one of the boys kicked him. In response, Hobbs struck the boy. According to Hollingsworth, all 4 perpetrators participated in beating the boys before the brutal killings. A troubling aspect of this story is Stewart's claim that in 1995 he attempted to contact West Memphis police investigator Bill Sanders to report what Buddy Lucas had told him, but Sanders never returned his calls. But this is the same Buddy Lucas that was friends with Jessie Misskelley, and Buddy had told police that Jessie confessed to hurting 3 boys. Both stories can't be true. Either Buddy Lucas was involved in the murders and said Jessie confessed to him to distance himself from the crime, or he wasn't involved himself and Jessie did confess. The third option is that Buddy made up both stories, but L.G. Hollingsworth also confessed, implicating both himself and Buddy Lucas. And there is one witness who corroborates the sex in the woods story, Aaron Hutchison, who was friends with the victims. He was interviewed by police with his mother present, and he claimed that he and the other boys had witnessed men having sex in the woods and hid from them. He said these men were part of a cult and wore black. Could it be that the boys witnessed some men having sex and were killed for it? With so many different confessions, it's difficult to know who is telling the truth, but weirdly, a lot of these confessions do have similar information, and some of Terry Hobbs' own family members think he was responsible for the murders. In 2012, Terry Hobbs' nephew allegedly told his friends, "My Uncle Terry murdered those 3 little boys," and that the killings was a Hobbs family secret. Jesse, Damien, and Jason were convicted of the murders of Michael Moore, Christopher Byers, and Stevie Branch. Jason and Jesse were sentenced to life in prison, while Damien was sentenced to death. On August 19, 2011, the trio entered an Alford plea, which allowed them to assert their innocence while acknowledging the state had enough evidence to convict. The 3 men pleaded guilty, though Jason Baldwin was reluctant. He said he didn't want to plead guilty to something he didn't do, but he went ahead with it to free Damien from death row. The state sentenced them to 18 years and 78 days, amounting to time already served. It meant they could go home. The Alford plea does not mean the men were exonerated. They are still convicted murderers, but all 3 men have maintained their innocence. Currently, Damien Echols is pushing for DNA testing of untested evidence in the case. Notably, he has been pushing for the ligatures to be tested for touch DNA. In April 2024, the Arkansas Supreme Court reversed a lower court's order denying Echols' post-conviction motion for DNA testing for lack of jurisdiction. So new DNA testing is allowed and could be underway right now. Some people think the West Memphis Three are guilty. Others are convinced Terry Hobbs is the killer. But what do you think happened to Michael Moore, Christopher Byers, and Stevie Branch? Leave a comment below.